When you're in a small town called Twisted Tree, aren't you kind of begging for a serial killer problem? Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you so much for joining me again. Today I have a review for you. This is of the book Sleep Tight by J.H. Markert, and this is going to be released in the middle of September, and I received a copy from the publisher in exchange for an honest review. So this is billed as a horror suspense thriller story, and the horror elements are kind of light for me, but what it is definitely a thriller and a suspense story. The heart of the story is, we know there is a serial killer who was caught in Twisted Tree. Again, you're just asking for problems if you name your town Twisted Tree. I'm sorry. But when they catch him finally, they find 19 bodies and one survivor, a young boy. And cut to 20 years later, and he's finally put to death, the serial killer, after he's been caught. And yet the day after he is executed, the detective who is in charge of the case is gruesomely murdered. And the detective's daughter, who is now also a detective, is on the case, and it's clearly connected to this previous serial killer. Now, whether it is an accomplice, whether it is a copycat, whether it is a devotee, we don't know, right? And that's part of the mystery. But before we can figure anything out, this detective, Tess, her daughter is then kidnapped by the antagonist, who we are trying to catch, who is killing people left and right, kidnapping children, and everything goes back to that hometown where they come from. So it's a police procedural in some ways, but it's really about this mystery of solving what happened in the past in order to figure out what's happening in the future. And it has this kind of frenetic energy, and it almost feels like a true crime story, actually. And I think part of that is because the characters are so well developed. So our main character is Tess, and we follow her primarily, though we do jump to other points of view. Her partner, as well as her partner's wife and her husband. Sometimes her daughter who's been kidnapped, sometimes the person who kidnapped the daughter. So you jump around, but you mostly stay with Tess. And I think what makes this feel like a true crime story to some extent is because the characters are so well-rounded. They feel like genuine, real characters and who are behaving in the way you'd expect them to behave given these circumstances. The pacing of the book is really frenetic. And I think part of that is, whenever you have a story about a serial killer who abducts children, then the cops are always very anxious to try to catch the killer. That's the way it always goes. But when the person who's kidnapped is the detective's daughter, that adds this kind of desperation and this frenzy that I think is really well portrayed in the character of Tess. So she is acting recklessly and always running towards the danger because she cares about saving her daughter so much. And I think that adds an edge to this story that you don't see in other similar detective stories or suspense thriller, serial killer stories. So it really adds something to it that I think is great. I think her character is deep, well-rounded. You see her going through grief, going through trauma in real time as she's trying to be a good cop, follow the clues, and not let her emotions get the best of her. Meanwhile, her father was just brutally murdered. Her daughter has been kidnapped. She's in this rocky situation with her husband and their relationship. So everything is kind of going to shit at the same time. And she's trying to do her best, obviously, to save her daughter, but in the process of that, she has to look back at things that happened in the past that she doesn't want to face. So she's convinced she has to find the boy who survived, because he must have some answers. He is in an asylum for the criminally insane, and you find out why, what put him there. And so she's convinced she has to go visit him, but in doing so, it brings up all of these memories for her that she had repressed and forgotten about. And that's kind of a trademark of many of these serial killer horror stories, is that the main protagonist has something in their past that you find out later in the end of the story. And I will say the writing does fall into a lot of these tropes that you're used to in this kind of story, but it never feels easy or lazy. They feel earned every time. So even though by the end of the story, put it this way, I didn't guess what was going to happen before it happened. But then once it did happen, I was like, oh yeah, of course that makes sense, So it was comfortable in the tropes that it was playing with. It didn't really subvert your ideas of what this kind of story could be, yet it wasn't lazy. And so it had fun with all of these tropes that it was playing with. The characters were, I thought, really well done. They made the story convincing. The world building was quite simple. It was just the world we live in, but like the tension that all of our characters are feeling and the desperation made it feel very visceral, made it feel real. So I thought the world building was really well crafted. The writing was really nice. It was smooth. It flowed. It really was frenetic. You felt the anxiety and the tension, especially from our main character. And so I enjoyed the writing. I thought it complemented the story really well. It put you in the middle of the action. I thought the pacing was really good. Splitting to different points of view, even though we mainly stayed with one character, gave us enough intrigue to get a bigger picture than we're used to and to always push the plot forward. And I thought very smartly, about 3/4 of the way through the story, when the action really starts to pick up, our main characters all separate because they have to chase their own independent leads. And there's a real sense of peril, right? So I think he does a really good job of separating the characters in a way that feels organic. A lot of time in, a thriller or a horror story or any of these, the characters separate when they all should be staying together and there's no reason for it except for the plot needs it to happen. But here it feels organic. So when our characters go their different ways, then they all get put into genuine peril, and for different reasons they can't communicate with each other. So we get all the pieces of the story, where every one of our characters is only getting small pieces of the story, which makes us know more than the characters, which is always an exciting thing in this kind of story. So we feel like we're a step ahead, but that doesn't happen the whole time. That only comes as the story is wrapping up. We get to see the ending just a little bit before the characters do, and then we see them discover it and then navigate what's going to happen. So I thought the pacing and the writing was really, really well done. The dialogue was smooth and it flowed. It felt natural. It felt kind of genuine. And that is always something that's hard in these kind of stories because tensions are so high. People speak in hyperbole, but not here. Everything felt like actual dialogue, like real humans would say. So the story, it falls into some tropes that you're going to expect, but it's satisfying in the end. The way the mystery wraps up is satisfying. Not everything is tied up with a neat little bow, which is always nice, that there's some messiness involved. There's a messiness throughout the whole story, which I appreciated. I will say that if you wanted to, there are interesting themes that he plays with in this story. Of course, childhood trauma being one of them and how you navigate trauma, but also the idea of kind of repressed violence or internalized violence and how that affects your psyche. What it means to be constantly seeking out external validation. And the only way you can understand your own self-worth is by having others express their appreciation for you. So always seeking outside of yourself to find meaning in your life. Trying to live up to your parents' expectations, especially in the case of Tess, whose father was this amazing detective. And now, meanwhile, she has a daughter who's been kidnapped by someone that is a copycat of the person who killed her father. Like, the whole thing is like, how can you live up to the legacy that your parents create for you? And are you valuable as an individual outside of your relationship to your parents or to the authority figures who bestow praise upon you, right? These are interesting ideas. He doesn't go into any of them in any depth, but what he does is he puts them in the background. So they're kind of like flavors in the background. They don't overwhelm the story. It's not an upmarket story that's really giving you a whole lot to think about, but it's giving you these little tastes that says, look, there's more here. There's depth to these characters. There's depth to their experiences, to their suffering, to the way they're living in the world that is interesting and exciting. And so if you want to, there are all these interesting places that you can go, that you can think about, that this story brings up, in the course of trying to save her daughter and catch this new killer. The story is dark. It is gripping. Once you start reading, you don't want to put it down. He does a great job of keeping you in the story and making you want to keep turning pages and not wait until tomorrow to finish. It's really well written, has interesting characters. It does fall into some familiar tropes. It's not going to subvert any tropes of the genre. So if you're expecting something to totally flip you on your head, that's not going to happen. But it doesn't feel lazy and it is a lot of fun to read. Sleep Tight by J.H. Markert. I do highly recommend it. I think it was a lot of fun, especially if you like true crime, if you like thriller, if you like these cat and mouse games between the police or not necessarily the police as a force, but detectives and serial killers, this whole kind of genre. I think it's a good entry in that genre and you'll have a lot of fun with it. Now, J.H. Markert has written a few other books, including Mr. Lullaby, among others. So have any of you read his other books? Are you interested in reading this? Let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. For now, thank you so much for spending time with me. I appreciate you. Be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.